Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us tonight at the Millennium Stage. Now please welcome your host for this evening's program, the principal coach of the Washington National Opera and the Domingo K. Fritz Young Artists Program, Ken Weiss.
Good evening, everybody. In just about an hour, the Washington National Opera will open its production of Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein's groundbreaking 1927 musical, Showboat. It's going to run for 15 performances through May 26th. And it's a story which is operatic in its scope. It takes you from the 1890s through to the 1920s. It takes you from small river towns in Mississippi to high society in Chicago. It's a story that, unlike any Broadway musical that came before it, takes a hard look at difficult issues, most of all racism. And it's set to a score that matches the epic sweep of the story, that takes in vaudeville song and dance and operetta and spirituals and jazz. Tonight, we're going to have a look at how Jerome Kern came to master those many styles of music. We're going to hear some examples from shows besides Showboat. And then we're going to talk about how Showboat came to be written and hear some music from the show itself. Joining me tonight are pianist Joy Schreier, members of Washington National Opera's Showboat Company, and members of the Domingo K. Fritz Young Artist Program. Jerome Kern was musical from an early age. His mother taught him piano and organ, and he was interested in going to music as a field. His father, who owned a department store, was insistent that after high school graduation he should go into the family business. And one of his early assignments was to order 2 pianos for the store. He screwed up. He ordered 200. He got to go to music school. He trained first at the New York College of Music, and then he went abroad. He went to Heidelberg, Germany for 2 years of lessons, and he came back through London, where he did a stint working as a rehearsal pianist, to New York. And when he got back to New York, one of the first jobs he had was writing replacement numbers for operettas. Now, operettas were sort of the dominant middle-brow kind of entertainment, the entertainment that was not quite so serious as grand opera, but classier than vaudeville, so you could take your mother to it. And the operettas that were performed in New York at that time were mostly imports from England and from the continent. Think Strauss, the Gypsy Baron, or Lehar, the Merry Widow. Sometimes numbers in those operettas were judged not to be effective for American audiences. And so one of Kern's jobs was to write replacement numbers to be inserted in these operettas. For example, in 1905, he concocted a number called How'd You Like to Spoon with Me for a show called The Earl and the Girl. The influence of operetta turns up in the many, many waltzes that Kern wrote, and also in the classical European-style harmony that you hear in many of his tunes, including the one we're about to hear from Chantal Chibolo, soprano, and Joy Schreier, pianist. It's called Yesterdays, and he wrote it for the show Roberta with lyricist Otto Harbach.
Sweet sequester days, golden days, golden days, days of mad romance and love, joys were mine to take, mine to give, gaily flaming, life was mine to live. Sad am I, glad am I,
That's a real operetta-style lyric, despite the fact that it was written in 1933. Yesterday's days I knew as happy, sweet, sequestered days. You don't get the word sequestered in a romantic lyric that often, but it's a lovely use of it. Operetta was not the only kind of music going on in the New York that Kern came back to in the early 1900s. This is the heyday of Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley originally meant a stretch of West 28th Street, just off of Broadway, where all the musical publishers were congregated, and there were so many pianos tinkling out of the music publishers' offices that it sounded like the banging of a whole bunch of tin pans. One of Kern's jobs when he got back there was to work as a song plugger. This is a guy who worked for a music publisher, and if a customer came in and wanted to buy a song, he would sit at the piano and preview the song, rather like the previews you get on iTunes now. And so he knew a tremendous amount of vaudeville and jazz material, early jazz material, ragtime material, which he puts to good use when he writes Showboat. Not only could the songs be sold to customers who wanted to buy sheet music, they could also, of course, be placed with vaudeville performers, placed in revues, which were one of the dominant forms of musical entertainment. Just a loosely connected series of skits and songs, the most famous of them being the series of Ziegfeld Follies that producer Florenz Ziegfeld put together, and his frolics which were like the Follies, but up on the rooftop of his theater late at night. There's a bunch of vaudeville, by the way, in Showboat, because the show follows performers from the period of 1890 to 1920, and their performances are part of the action. Most of the vaudeville numbers that appear in Showboat aren't actually by Kern. He drew on his vast knowledge of the repertoire and picked classics of the genre that would really give his audience a flavor of times gone by. You can hear the jazz and ragtime influences that Kern picked up in pieces like another one he wrote for Roberta called I Won't Dance, which you may remember was a big dance number for Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. We'll hear it now from soprano Talise Trevine and bass Solomon Howard.
Think of what you're losing by constantly refusing to dance with me. You've been idle friends with me, and still you stand there and shake your foolish head dramatically, while I stand here so ecstatically. You just look and see emphatically.
But this is, and there's a reason. I won't dance, don't ask me. I won't dance, don't ask me. I won't dance, madam, with you. My heart won't let my feet do things they should do. You know what? You're lovely.
And so what? I
But oh, what you do to me, I'm like an ocean wave that's bumped on the shore. I feel so absolutely stumped on the floor.
When you dance, you're charming and you're gentle, especially when you do the continental.
But this feeling isn't purely mental. For heaven rest us, I'm not asbestos, and that's why I won't dance. Why should I won't dance. How could I won't dance. Merci beaucoup. I know that music leads the way to romance. So if I hold you in my arms, I won't dance.
When you dance, you're charming and you're gentle, especially when you do the continental.
But this feeling isn't purely mental. For heaven rest us, I'm not asbestos, and that's why I won't dance. Why should I won't dance. How could I won't dance. Merci beaucoup. I know that music leads the way to romance. So if I hold you in my arms, I won't dance.
So Kern knew a lot of vaudeville and knew a lot of jazz. He wasn't really interested in writing for vaudeville, and he wasn't interested in writing freestanding songs. What Kern was interested in doing is writing what were called book shows, shows in which the songs are integrated completely into the plot. And he did a groundbreaking series of shows at a little tiny theater, a 299-seat theater in New York called the Princess Theater. He did them with a librettist named Guy Bolton and with the lyricist P.G. Wodehouse, who you may remember wrote the Jeeves books later. The Princess Theater shows were remarkable because they were stories in which the songs were integrated into the action like an operetta, but they used vernacular language, the way jazz and ragtime songs did, and the stories were not about the kind of obscure European nobility that turned up in operettas. They were about contemporary people. And those shows were a tremendous hit. The music that Kern wrote for them is interesting. It brings together European influences and jazz influences. And the lyrics that were crafted for Kern's songs from this period on, they combine the romanticism of the operetta with plain-spoken English. And they create something that's elegant but not fussy, and colloquial but not slangy. We know these pieces today mostly as jazz standards, although that is not how Kern and Hammerstein and the other librettists that Kern worked with thought of them. They were very adamant, Kern was especially, that these shows, these songs be seen in the context of the shows they were written for. So much that Kern occasionally refused to let individual sheets of music be published for these songs. He wanted them always to be viewed as part of the shows. We will hear three now that have become jazz standards because the shows in which they originally appeared have been forgotten. The first is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, which he wrote again for Roberta with Otto Harbach. We'll hear contralto Gwendolyn Brown. Then Solomon Howard, bass, will return for The Way You Look Tonight, which he wrote for the movie Swing Time. And then from a show called Very Warm for May, Talise Trevine will return to give us All the Things You Are, which has a lyric by Oscar Hammerstein.
often replied, something here inside cannot be denied. They said someday you'll find our love, our blind. When your heart's on the fire, you will realize smoke gets in your eyes. So I chaffed, and then I gaily laughed to think they could doubt my love. But today my love has flown away. I am without my love. Now, laughing friends deride, tears I cannot hide. So I smile and say, when a lovely flame dies, smoke gets in your eyes. Now, laughing friend deride, tears I cannot hide. So I smile and say, when a lovely flame dies, smoke gets in your eyes. Someday, when I'm awfully low and the world is cold, I will feel a glow just thinking of you and the way you look tonight. Oh, but you're lovely, with your smile so warm and your cheeks so soft. There is nothing for me but to love you, just the way you look tonight. With each word your tenderness grows, tearing my fears apart, and that laugh that wrinkles your nose touches my foolish heart. Love never change. Keep that breathless charm. Won't you please arrange it, 'cause I love you just the way you look tonight. Just the way you look tonight.
Time and again I long for adventure, something to make my heart beat the faster. Now that I long for, I never really knew. Finding your love, I found my adventure. Touching your hand, my heart beats the faster. All that I want in all this world is you. Someday my arms will only hold you, and all things even seem long. Someday, the breathless hush of evening, will bring come a lovely song. You are the angel glow that lights a star. The very things I know are what you are. Someday my happy arms will hold you, and someday I know that moment divine when all the things you
Let's turn now to Showboat itself. The musical is based on a 1926 novel by Edna Ferber. And Jerome Kern read it and knew immediately he wanted to set it. And this is a very unusual thing. You think about the turnaround. This would be fast even for a movie. The book comes out in 1926. The show comes out in 1927. There's an anecdote that Ethan Morden tells in his book Make Believe that Kern approached the critic Alexander Wolcott at a Broadway premiere and asked if he might be able to introduce Kern to Edna Ferber. And Wolcott supposedly said, well, I might be able to arrange it, then turned to the woman on his other side and said, Ferber, this is Kern. Kern, this is Ferber. At the core of the story is the couple Magnolia Hawks, who is the daughter of a riverboat captain, and the river gambler Gaylord Ravenel. They meet when Magnolia's family's showboat docks in a small Mississippi River town. The two feel an instant attraction. They become the romantic leads in the showboat's productions. They develop a romance in real life. They marry. They go north to Chicago. After a few years of gambling, though, Ravenel's fortunes change. He goes broke. Consumed with shame, he leaves Magnolia alone to raise their young daughter. Needing to earn a living, she goes back to performing, first in a Chicago nightclub, and then after great success, eventually in Broadway theaters. Years later, Ravenel will come back into her life. He comes to see her while she's visiting her parents on the showboat where their romance began, and she must decide whether to take him back. We're going to hear first the scene in which they first meet, and the duet in which they first meet is called Make Believe. And in Make Believe, you'll hear a lot of operetta influence, both in the lyric and in the style of the music. You'll hear, for example, that there is a slow waltz in the middle section, rather like something out of Lehar's Merry Widow. We will hear soprano Chantal Pchillo, baritone Norman Garrett, and again at the piano, Joy Schreier. You can have a little insight into Kern and Hammerstein's working method with that song, by the way. It was not uncommon for Kern to write the music first and then for Hammerstein to fit lyrics to it. And in this case, for example, Hammerstein heard the tune, dee-da-dum, dee-da-da-da-da-da, and the first thing that popped into his head was, couldn't you, couldn't I, couldn't we, and he built the rest of the lyric around it. A lot of the plot of Showboat has to do with the relationships between black and white Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the show, Gaylord Ravenel is white. Indeed, a love duet between white and black characters would have been as shocking in the Broadway of 1927 as it would have been in 1880s Mississippi, where the show begins. In fact, it is an incident hinging on the intersection of love and race that brings Magnolia and Ravenel together on the Showboat. At the beginning of the show, the romantic leads in the Showboat plays are played by a husband and wife team, Julie and Steve Baker. Steve is a white man. Julie is a biracial woman passing as white. Interracial marriage, or relationships of any kind, what was then called miscegenation, was a felony in much of America well into the 20th century. When Julie rejects the advances of a crewman named Pete, he takes revenge by reporting her to the local sheriff. The couple narrowly escape jail, and they're forced to leave the Showboat, and Magnolia and Ravenel step into the leads. Now, Showboat broke new ground on Broadway in many ways in the way it dealt with race. First of all, there were black and white performers together on Broadway stages before Showboat, but usually it involved a mostly white review with a black star performer doing a star turn, or perhaps playing servants, comic foils to white principals. But in Showboat, black characters are at the center of the action. And the show, in fact, calls for two complete choruses, one black, one white. Even more extraordinary was the way that Showboat took a hard look at racial prejudice. The frilly operettas and light-hearted reviews that typified Broadway didn't really deal with serious issues at all, let alone a hot-button issue like race. Oscar Hammerstein, the librettist, was particularly passionate about the issues of prejudice. Those of you who know South Pacific may remember the very bitter song he writes for Lieutenant Cable in that show. He's in love with a Polynesian woman, and he sings a song called "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught." You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. The fact that Showboat took this issue seriously is one reason that music historians have often divided Broadway musical history into two sections: everything that came before Showboat and everything that came after it. We're going to hear one of the numbers for one of the African-American leads, in this case Queenie, the Showboat's cook. On the morning where Julie and Steve are turned into the sheriff, Queenie wakes up with a sense of foreboding. Kern and Hammerstein wrote her a number called "Misery's Comin' Around." It never made it to Broadway. It was cut after one performance in the first out-of-town tryout, which was here in Washington at the National Theater. Lots of stuff was cut during that tryout because the show ran between 4 and 4.5 hours. But Kern remained fond of the song, and in fact, he used it to start the overture of Showboat, even long after it was cut, when it didn't appear in the show anymore. Francesca Zambello has reinstated it in WNO's production, so you can hear it again in Washington, where it got started. Here to sing it for you is contralto Gwendolyn Brown.
Heaven keep the devil away, keep that misery far away, and if he's a-coming today, heaven don't let him stay. Misery's coming around, so if you've done any wrong, just keep your feet on the ground and fly away. If you've done any wrong, just keep your feet off the ground and fly away, and fly away. Misery's here, I don't know why it is near, don't know for who, don't know for why that misery's near. I know misery's done come here. Let me rest with a dish on my breast. Some give nickel, some give time. All them folks is friends of mine. On my back in a hack, in a $40 hack. No more gin, no more rum. Oh, misery's done come.
As we mentioned at the outset, Showboat has a sprawling story, especially in the novel. It spans 40 years in the novel, and so many locales. And Hammerstein realized early on that he needed some kind of element to tie the whole show together. And he realized that the one constant through the book is the Mississippi River itself, and he decided to make it a character in the number that we know as Old Man River. The number has the feel of a spiritual about it. Spirituals had been popularized for general audiences by a series of recitals in New York by African-American singers, most notably by the great bass baritone Paul Robeson in 1925. Robeson was the singer for which the role of Joe in Showboat was intended. He didn't end up creating it, but he did join the production later, and he, of course, made the famous 1936 film version. I want to read you a little bit of a quote from Hammerstein, which shows you how much of a craftsman he was. You know, he was not the flashiest rhymer of the lyricists working on Broadway, but he was a consummate craftsman who worried about every detail of his lyrics. And he talks about his thought process when he was putting the lyric for Old Man River together. He says, "River, instead of being repeated in the second line, could have had a rhyme, shiver, quiver, etc. The next two lines could have rhymed with the first two, the iver sounds continuing, or they could have had two new words rhyming with each other. But I do not believe that in this way I could have commanded the same attention and respect from a listener, nor would a singer be so likely to concentrate on the meaning of the words. There are, of course, compensations for the lack of rhyme. I've mentioned repetition. There's also the trick of matching up words. Something and nothing don't rhyme, but the two words are related. He don't plant taters, he don't plant cotton. These two lines also match and complement each other to make up for the lack of a rhyme." Here's a song sung by a character who is a rugged and untutored philosopher. It is a song of resignation with a protest implied. Brilliant and frequent rhyming would diminish its importance. We'll hear Old Man River now, sung by bass Solomon Howard.
There's an old man called Mississippi. That's the old man that I'd like to be. What does he care if the world's got troubles? What does he care if the land ain't free? Old man River, that old man River, he must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling, he keeps on rolling along. He don't plant taters, he don't plant cotton, and them that plant some is soon forgotten. But Old Man River, it just keeps rolling along. You and me, we sweat and strain, body all aching and wrecked with pain. Top that part, lift that pail, get a little drunk, and you'll untain tail. Kids weary and sick are trying. I'm tired of living and scared of dying. But Old Man River, he just keeps rolling along.
The number that closes our preview today shows how well Kern absorbed all the jazz and ragtime influences that he heard while he was working on Tin Pan Alley. You remember he wasn't interested in writing freestanding jazz numbers, but this number, Can't Help Lovin' That Man, is an integral part of the plot. It appears early on in the show. Magnolia, who's infatuated after her first meeting with Ravenel, asks Julie what she loves about her husband, Steve. And the number foreshadows the revelation that's coming later about Julie. Because Queenie overhears Julie singing it and remarks how odd it is that Julie is singing a song that she's only ever heard African Americans sing. Before we hear it, I want to remind you that Showboat opens tonight in the Opera House. It will run 14 more performances through May 26th. And now, here's Talise Trevine with Chantel Gibolo, Gwendolyn Brown, Solomon Howard, and pianist Joy Schreier in Can't Help Lovin' That Man of Mine.
Why do you love Steve? I don't know. He's such a bad actor on the stage, and he thinks he's so good. Maybe that's why I love him. You see, child, love's a funny thing. There's just no sense to it. That's why you gotta be so careful when it comes creeping up on you.
It's like that thing you always sing when we take our walks.
I know. Fish gonna swim, birds gonna fly. I gotta love one man till I die. Can't help loving that man of mine. Tell me he's lazy, tell me he's slow. Tell me I'm crazy, maybe I know. Can't help loving that man of mine.
How come y'all know that song?
What? Do you know it, Queenie?
For sure I does. I ain't never heard nobody but colored folks sing that song. Seemed kind of funny for Miss Julie to know it.
What? Julie sings it all the time.
Can you sing the whole thing?
Of course I can. What's so funny about that? Oh, listen, sister, I love my Mr. Man, and I can't tell you why. There ain't no reason why I should love that man. It must be something that the angels done planned. Fish gotta swim and birds gotta fly. I gotta love one man till I die. Can't help loving that man of mine. Tell me he's lazy, tell me he's slow. Tell me I'm crazy, maybe I know. Can't help loving that man of mine. When he goes away, that's a rainy day. And when he comes back, that day is fine. The sun will shine. He can come home as late as can be. Home without him ain't no home to me. Can't help loving that man of mine.
Well, that's beautiful, Miss Julie.
Was that you, Miss Julie? That's my favorite song.
My mind is shiftless and good for nothing too. He's my man just the same. He's never near me when there is work to do. I'm never around here when there's working to do. The chimney's smoking, the roof is leaking in, but he don't seem to care. He can be happy with just a sip of gin.
Why you all talking about gin?
I even love him when his kiss is gin. Fish can swim, birds can fly.
in the sky.
Lord, back till I die. Can't help loving that man of mine.
She ain't my gal, she's crazy.
Baby, I know. Can't and that